Hello and welcome back to No Books on Dead Planet, the podcast where we read climate books so you don't have to, but the hope is that maybe you'll be tempted after overhearing all of our conversations to pick one up. Thank you so much for listening to season 1. My name is Leena Norms, and I'm here to give you a little interregnum, a little. I'm going to warm you up for season 2. Thank you so much for listening to season 1. If you have, I am so excited to be releasing season 2. The first episode will come out right at the end of October, and we are reading The Uninhabitable Earth, the most terrifying climate book that I have genuinely put off for years. I started it in maybe like 2018, and I was so scared by it that I stopped reading it, but I actually then started picking up other climate books instead. But I thought, because it's Halloween and because we're here in the dark corners of our mind, facing our fears and getting a little zing from it, I thought that we'd read The Uninhabitable Earth, and we're reading that with Corrie of the Sci Guys podcast. So I'm really, really excited for you to hear that episode, and if you'd like to read along, please do. But I'm going to give you a few parish notes in this episode. I'm going to run you through a little highlight, a little kind of tapas table of all of the books we've already talked about. So if you haven't gone back and listened to those episodes, or you'd like to revisit them, it's a little pick and mix, bring and share table where you can hear what's on offer and see what you might want to go back and listen to. And I'm also going to tell you about a few things that have happened with the podcast. It's very exciting. So the first thing that has happened is that I have been releasing some climate patches to go along with the podcast. I'm really, really excited about this project. It's a way for us to fund the podcast without having to take on any sponsorship or get into bed with any suspicious companies. And it's also just a way for you to be incentivized to act on the things that you're listening to in this podcast and learning. And the same for me. I think that I really struggle to actually act on what I feel and actualize it, and my brain is very silly and very petty, and it really responds to rewards. Not only does it respond well to rewards, it responds well to stickers, badges, trophies, little trinkets, little silly glittery things. And while I wish that I was a deeper and more profound person, that is just who I am. So if you are also that person, you might be interested in the Positive Panic patches. I have made 5 of them. They all have optional challenges attached, so you can just buy them and use them to rejuvenate the clothes that you already own, or even patch up and mend the clothes that you already own. We love that for you. That is a way that you can basically make your own merch for this podcast. You can use them like that. They just look snazzy. I'm not gonna lie. I can say that because I didn't design them. My friend Sophie from Gung, which is an amazing sustainable design brand, designed them. They look incredible, but if you would like to use them as almost scout-esque little challenges for yourself, you can also do that. And I've explained on the website what each challenge is and how you can customize it for yourself. I am currently earning the book badge because the book badge is a challenge where you're supposed to read that book. So it's either that book, as in like your first book on the climate ever, just like you get a badge for reading the first book on the climate that you dare to pick up, however diluted, however beginner, that's fine, you still get the badge. Or it can, if you've already read climate books, it can be just that book. And when I say that book, I mean that book that you've been avoiding, that one book that it keeps coming up in conversation, or you keep seeing on bookstore tables, or it keeps coming up and you're like, oh, you're just gone, I don't want to read it. Or maybe you've even bought the book but it's been on your shelf for months or even years because you're like, I can't do that right now, don't make me. This is your incentive to get that book off the shelf and into your brain, and you get a shiny badge at the end. So that's the example of one of them, but there are 5 altogether. If you want to go and take a look at them and see if you would like to support the podcast and buy some, they are at leenanorms.com/shop. I feel like people in podcasts tend to repeat things, so I'm going to repeat that for you because I've heard other people do it. leenanorms.com/shop. We also have a London event coming up in November. In the interests of keeping this podcast evergreen, I won't go on about that too much, but if you would like to hear more about that, it's on my Instagram at leenanorms and on my YouTube community tab as well. So if you are listening to this in the present and you would like to attend an event in London, that's also happening. Let's go through some of the books that we read in the last season because it was a really wild ride. And I actually went back and I listened to every single episode, which was fun and hilarious and really heartwarming. I also had to listen to me say awkward things because I'm not very good at talking about the climate. I don't think I've really mastered it yet, but I am out here publicly trying. But I was really lucky to have so many amazing guests that really believed in the podcast and set aside time to read the books. So I've got to give you a little whistle-stop tour of what we talked about. The first episode, of course, was with the incredible, delectable Ariel Bissett, who is one of my best friends in the whole world. So a great place to start when it comes to reading books about the climate. Grab somebody who already knows you inside out. That always makes it easier. And we read Weird the Weather, which is my favourite book on the climate. I think it still is, you know. It's one that I read very much at the beginning of my reading the climate books journey, #journey. And it's by Jonathan Safran Foer, who is a author. He's a fiction author. And I really think that makes a difference to the way the message comes across, the way he warms you up to what he's trying to say, and the kind of really inventive, beautiful metaphors that he uses to help you unlock the apathy that you might have built up over the years when it comes to climate news. So it was lovely to revisit that one. I've actually read that book 4 times. I know, I just really like it. And also it's really good in audiobook, and it's only like 4.5 hours, I think. So there's also that. So a lot of the book covers this idea of facing the end, in inverted commas, and this idea of climate change being a mass suicide event in some way, a way of us self-harming in a way that is slightly unimaginable if we weren't sitting in the midst of it. And it's really beautiful. There's parts of it that are really funny and lighthearted as well. But what two of the big topics are this idea of self-harm on a collective scale, and the symbolism of food, where food becomes not just a conscious decision, something that we are just objectively deciding on what to eat, but it becomes an emotional decision, something that we actually do as groups as well. And he goes through loads of different cultures and situations and scenarios and traditions where it is really hard to give up meat when it comes with that generational emotional attachment. That was really beautiful. Me and Ariel talked about this, like the hard reality of having to like turn down food from your community if it's not the food that you think is morally right, and how that feels and how that's hard to negotiate. And you know, if my mum comes up to me and gives me something that it symbolizes care and symbolizes attention and symbolizes love, something that she spent time making, and I turn it down, I feel differently about my own moral beliefs when it comes to how that applies to my life. So we had a really interesting talk about that. And there was also a part that I remember Ariel saying where she said there was this idea of scaffolding in your life. So on page 43, Jonathan talks about the emotions around Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, and how 96% of the US do take time off during that time and go and visit their families, which is a really, really high number, and Ariel was really shocked by that, as was I, to be fair. And it's not that those people are necessarily celebrating Thanksgiving, which is a slightly hot potato, but that they are given the mechanism of time to connect with their families because everybody is given time off to do so. So when we talked about the mechanisms of joining in on things, for example, with a universal sign of like moving out of the way for a ambulance, or you don't make a decision to join in a crowd wave at a football match, you just do it. Inserting those kind of mechanisms into society, those ways of like it being more fun to join in, or just you don't think about a moral decision to join in, you just do, and making those decisions collectively rather than putting them on the individual was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that episode, and me and Ariel had loads of giggles about Big Milk and Spider-Man and other things. Next, we read Consumed. Me and Ash Tanya read Consumed, and I learned so much from that book. It kind of talks slightly biographically about the author's career in fashion, but it also talks globally about the misconceptions we have around the clothing industry, what we wear, and where it actually comes from. And as somebody who'd already watched the True Cost documentary, already read quite a few articles on ethics and clothes and the planet, I learned so much. And I just came away with like not only fun facts, but just a kind of new framework for how to think about what we wear. So I think it was a really, really valuable book. We talked about NIMBYism, which is the not in my backyard kind of attitude to life that we are often handed when we grow up, and how it doesn't always translate into a great choice in reality, and talked about this idea of clothes that aren't good enough for me but would be good enough for others. I've definitely done that, where I've donated in inverted commas clothes to a charity shop thinking, oh, they're not good enough for me to wear, they're a bit ratty, but somebody else will have them. And the kind of toxic attitudes around that, as well as the reality of charity shops not actually being able to cope with the amount that is donated. Ash talked about her experience of being in Zimbabwe and growing up around secondhand markets, that experience of seeing hand bales en masse of clothes from the West that haven't been able to be sold in charity shops, that are coming over uncurated, and the sinisterness of seeing an outfit on Shein or on her newsfeed in ads, and then just a few weeks or few months later seeing it in those bales in markets in Zimbabwe, and how we don't really have a true idea of the volume of clothes that are moving through the clothes system and at what rate. And this is my favourite fact from the book, and I say favourite lightly because I don't want it to be true, but 25% of all the clothes that are in Kantamanta, which is one of the biggest markets like this as all of the clothes waste goes, are charity themed t-shirts. So t-shirts that are printed for one event, ironically to help people for charity, and are then just discarded and thrown away. And the kind of like misguided intentions around making charity t-shirts, and companies producing and overproducing all these t-shirts because of the economies of scale. Like, you know, it might be one price to print 100, but a very, very cheaper price to maybe print 500, and then throwing them away. So all of that is really interesting. There's also a really great part of the book that talks about our language around other countries and developing and third world being quite outdated and damaging terms, and instead replacing that language with phrases like historically pillaged, which can sound a little bit laborious at the beginning, but I've actually started getting used to saying that. I'm practicing, and I think it was really, really interesting conversation that me and Ash had. Love her, and love her channel as well. Braiding Sweetgrass with Levi Hildebrand. Oh, Levi, our Canadian correspondent, he radioed in to talk to us about Robin Wall Kimmer's book, which is one of the seminal, I think, climate texts that is apparently pretty famous, more in Canada and the US, I think. Robin talks from a native perspective of her vision of the climate crisis and her vision of what could go right, what could be solved. Explains at a very base level the concepts of things like land back and native knowledge. Me and Levi from that book had a really interesting conversation around patriotism and what it means to be proud of where you're from, or proud of the land that you live on, and in various degrees how that has changed for both of us depending on the country that we were born in, and the kind of implications of that, especially because of settler narratives in Canada versus me living in the UK as, I guess, in inverted commas, a native, heavy inverted commas, but knowing that I live in a country that has pillaged lots of other people's land. Levi talked about his geography degree and this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which I learned a lot from, and we also discussed this beautiful marketplace dream that Robin has in the book that you must go back and listen to and read, because it's really, really beautiful. And this idea of visiting a market where you don't have any money and therefore you start taking less, like knowing the people and being able to look at the people in the face that you are taking from or buying from, and instinctively knowing what you need versus what you want in a way that you wouldn't if you didn't look people in the eyes. So I really, really loved that chat. As you can tell, I loved all the chats. Once There Are Wolves is a book that I read with Maddie Dreisbeck. Apex predators is a thing, but something that might sound a little bit dull to read about in a paper or in an article. But what if it was Charlotte McConaughey setting it as a fiction book in sexy, dark, deepest Scotland, where a woman who is a scientist has been sent to this rural village to negotiate the rewilding of wolves back into Scotland, which is something that is fictional. It's something that people are trying to get done in the UK at the moment, but this is an imagined timeline where they are actually achieving it, and wolves are coming back in, and why that is exciting and important. But you also get murder, sexy Scottish men, some steamy sex, and lots of intrigue, lots of small town conundrums and dramas, and you kind of learn by osmosis in this book. It's really interesting. Me and Maddie had a good conversation around what an awkward conversation is, how to navigate it. Maddie has a really, really great YouTube channel where she talks openly about sex and relationships in a way that maybe a lot of us British people might struggle with. So it was really important for me to talk to Maddie about that and how she deals with awkward conversations, because I think that is applicable to the climate. Those skills that some people have acquired in bringing up things that make other people melt, no pun intended, when it comes to the climate, I think those are applicable skills, and it was really, really interesting talking to her. We also talked about this idea of action versus inaction when it comes to abusive relationships, and where do we see ourselves in that. There is a situation in the book where somebody that the main character really loves is in an incredibly abusive relationship, but she knows that by telling her directly or shouting at her, that's not how human brains respond. So it's this idea of like how we negotiate people's toxic relationship with their own habits or their own life choices, and working with them in that, and inspecting ourselves about why we watch our lives go by, or we watch life decisions be made for us by governments or situations or traditions, and why we don't participate in those, and what makes us snap and actually start acting. So really, really interesting conversation, went in loads and loads of different directions. Then we read Parable of the Sower. I read that with Jack Edwards. Parable of the Sower is a kind of classic cli-fi book. It's one of the kind of seminal texts by Octavia Butler. It is very, very terrifying and very dark. So me and Jack had a bit of a support chat afterwards to go and support each other through what the hell we just read. It was very harrowing, but it was also really, really interesting, really skilled storytelling, and even more chilling knowing that the book starts in 2024, which is now only next year. Jack made the really interesting point that it's different from other kinds of dystopias because it is a world without. So many dystopias have been read where you have like plants or surveillance. There's our world, but there's also something else in it. Whereas Butler's work is really about a world without things. What if it was exactly like your world, but they didn't have all of these things? It's a really interesting meditation as well on the relationship between religion and the end of the world, and like inventing your own religion, which I kid you not is something that happens in the book. The main character starts inventing her own religion. And we both actually underlined this quote that I had now to repeat to you. It was really interesting that me and Jack had pulled out this exact same line in this big hefty book, so I had to read it out for you as well. The main character says, "I'm trying to be clear. I'm not interested in being fancy or even original. Clarity and truth will be plenty if only I can achieve them." And again, I think we had an interesting talk about how we feel pressured into having climate conversations that are perfect or polished or fancy or have all the right, like hit all the right beats and use all the right phrases. But actually this character, knowing that the state of the world that she is living in she's just trying to be clear and truthful. And those things are actually harder to achieve than we sometimes realise. So definitely loads and loads of food for thought in that book. If you're into fantasy or you fancy picking up something fictional, then that's your book. Then we read This is Vegan Propaganda with Melanie Murphy. I would say from a facts perspective, this book probably had the biggest effect on me, I think, when it comes to like what I actually knew or didn't know. The subtitle of this book is "And Other Lies the Meat Industry Tells You," and it really is a kind of whistle-stop tour, not only of like the sad stuff that happens to animals, but also just about like the general arguments and the really interesting philosophical debates we can get into when we talk about what is a sentient being. Why do we care about our pets but not about pigs? Why do we deny our own like ideas about things? And Ed, who wrote the book, is a very like interesting character and like a very caring, calm, like non-judgmental purveyor of the ideas around veganism. And as like discussed between me and Melanie, who neither are vegan, I think we both came to some really interesting conclusions, and Melanie was really generous and also discussed some of her thoughts and experience around eating disorders and choosing what you eat, and how that intersects with veganism, and how she's felt about veganism in the past versus how she feels about it now. And it was again a really interesting conversation. I don't know what other words to use because they were all interesting conversations. The last last one in the series was Climate Justice, and we read that with Michelle. Michelle Ellman is the author of many kind of self-help, I'm not going to call them self-help books, they're like motivational thought pieces with genuine applicable advice in them, like even templates for texts when it comes to relating to other people. My favourite of hers being The Joy of Being Selfish. So I had to talk to Michelle, and I just wanted to talk to her because I think that she has a really interesting perspective on things like judgment and shame. But it turned out that this was also, her first climate book. So she shares in the podcast how it felt to read her first climate book ever, why she feels like she hasn't read climate books before, her feelings around this idea of like everything happens for a reason, and how we often like try and romanticize bad things that are happening to other people, and bad things that are happening in other countries, and how we see those actions versus how the people who are living them see them. There are a lot of own voices in this book, but it is a book that is edited and kind of bookmarked and intersected with Mary Robinson, who is a big name in the climate movement. So it was really, really nice to hear from those people. We both agreed that the subtitle isn't really true. Like, it's not really about feminism and how feminism intersects with the climate. And I would like to read one of those books soon, maybe include it in the podcast as well. If you have any suggestions on books about gender and climate, that would be really great. This isn't that book. This is more, we kind of summarized it as how small people's stories and small people's actions fit into the bigger story of climate change. And it was a lot about people who have started grassroots movements in their own countries with their own expertise, and like talking about the impacts of those things and how they fit into everything else. Another really interesting memory from that talk is our discussion about activation energy. So like she talks about it when you're coming to like changing things in your own personal life. So going to the gym, you're much likely to go to the gym if the night before you lay out your gym kit, you plan it all out, you make your food before you go, all of those things, so that when you are in that mood for resisting or rebelling against your own choices and your own intentions, the activation energy it takes to follow through with what you intend to do is a lot less, because you've set yourself up to have like less. So when we were talking about activism, we were like, what if activism was also about reducing the activation energy people need to act, and how can we change the systems around that so that people actually find it easier to take action? Is that not activism in itself? Changing the system so that other people's who don't have as much energy to reinvent a system for themselves around their own personal choices, how do we make it easier for people? And that got my brain whirring on lots of different levels, and really, really excited me. So yeah, that's the whistle-stop tour of what's been happening in season 1. If you have missed it, go back and listen to whichever ones piqued your fancy. Get ready to tune into the first episode of season 2, which is coming at the end of October. If you would like to check out the Positive Panic patches and become a scout leader for the climate, let's take some climate dares, then you can go to leenanorms.com/shop, and you can also just follow me on Instagram if you want to hear about when episodes are coming out and all of that. I'm planning to release big episodes once a month, and I'm going to try and release some shorter episodes like this in between, little interregnum episodes about thoughts I've been having about the climate, other books that I've been reading about the climate, so that we can keep in touch in between the kind of big book club ideas. I'm on Instagram at Leena Norms, that's Leena. We got 2 E's in our name, don't you know? NORMS, norms as in gender norms. And you can also follow Positive Panic Patches, which is at Positive Panic Patches. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this podcast, do give it a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or just tell a friend. I'm a big believer in word of mouth. It's the OG original way of spreading things, and if it ain't broken, don't fix it. Thanks so much for listening.